versus a non-neural response when we talk about sensing the outer world. For plants, the response is not neural in the same way that our response is. Even if there is a neural response from an organism, we will also need to discern whether the response is indeed one of pain or the pain we perceive. We call it pain because we experience anguish from the nociceptive receptors responding to heat, cold, or pressure. But it is possible that some organisms with nociception systems don't translate or associate the stimulus with anguish. For instance, although flies will not stick around in extremely hot environments and will respond to heat in very interesting ways, whether they feel anguish as a result is not known. Even fish have been thought to be resilient to connecting nociception with anguish, or what we call pain. Some researchers argue that fish do not feel pain because they do not have the neural real estate. They have only a minimal cortex to produce the perception of pain. Others are adamant that their responses to noxious stimulation are indeed indicative of pain. The moral of this nociception story is that when we discuss the senses and perception, we need to be aware that not all the brains of organisms translate stimulus from the outer world into perception in the same way. Another sense that is not part of the Big Five is the simple perception of hot and cold. Flies, as I mentioned, do feel hot and cold, as do most other multicellular eukaryotes and even microbes. This is because the molecular mechanism for temperature reception in flies and humans is similar. Most organisms have a fail-safe mechanism for too much heat, called heat shock response. As part of this response, certain genes produce proteins that are activated when extremes of temperature are encountered. These proteins help the cells cope with the raised temperature. Other genes are present in organisms to help them cope with cold and are referred to as antifreeze proteins. These proteins also assist the cells in dealing with very cold temperatures. Yet, even though in these cases the molecules of cells perceive hot and cold, is this perception the same as takes place in a whole organism? Whether organisms perceive hot or cold depends on whether they have a brain and how that brain processes the information. For example, certain genes in the fly genome can be mutated so that a fly will not perceive hot or cold. The experiment for detecting these mutants is brutal, in that flies are placed on hot plates and observed. A wild-type fly will skedaddle once the hot plate exceeds 10 to 20 degrees above body temperature. Mutant flies, however, will sit until their legs begin to fry. Similar mutants for cold tolerance in flies have also been detected. We can infer that a fly perceives hot and cold because a response is generated, the skedaddle. Bacteria more than likely do not perceive hot and cold, but their proteins do. So there is an important line to draw when considering perception and simple physiological response. Other senses, not in the Big Five, might include sensing time of day, magnetic and electric fields, changes in blood pressure, and hunger, among others. But again, we need to determine whether we actually perceive these in a neural sense, or whether our cells are simply responding physiologically to some external change. Consider blood pressure, for example. When blood pressure rises, we might, or might not, know it. An extreme rise in blood pressure will trigger certain responses in our bodies that our brains don't outwardly recognize. More than likely, the response is physiological and pre-programmed, and not perceived. In other words, your body recognizes or senses the change in blood pressure, but you do not always intellectualize it, nor do you often perceive it in the same way that you perceive light hitting the retina of your eye.